The morning of October 15th, 1943, arrived with deceptive tranquility over the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi Zero fighter, his eyes scanning the endless expanse of Pacific sky below him. At 18,000 feet, the air was thin and cold, but his blood ran hot with the confidence that came from 37 victories painted on his aircraft's fuselage. He was hunting. Below him, glinting in the equatorial sun like a silver dart, flew an American fighter. The shape was unfamiliar to Nakamura, bulkier and heavier than the Wildcats he had grown accustomed to destroying over the past 2 years. This was one of the new Grumman F6F Hellcats he had heard whispers about in the ready rooms back at Rabaul. His squadron leader had warned them. These Americans were different, dangerous in ways the intelligence officers couldn't quite articulate. But Nakamura was not concerned. He had altitude, he had position, and he had skill honed through hundreds of hours of combat. The American pilot below seemed oblivious to his presence. Nakamura pushed forward on the stick, feeling his Zero respond with the eager nimbleness that had made it the terror of the Pacific. The acceleration was gentle but inexorable, the aircraft sliding into a diving attack with the grace of a hunting falcon. His airspeed indicator climbed past 200 knots, the needle trembling slightly as wind rushed over the wings. He armed his weapons, 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns, all perfectly synchronized. The American grew larger in his gun sight. At 400 yards, Nakamura opened fire. His tracers arced through the morning air, a stream of brilliant orange reaching toward the Hellcat. But the American pilot was no novice. The moment Nakamura's guns flashed, the Grumman fighter banked hard right, jinking violently to spoil his aim. Nakamura followed, his Zero cutting inside the American's turn with contemptuous ease. This was familiar territory. The dance of the dogfight, where his aircraft's legendary maneuverability gave him an overwhelming advantage. He had done this dozens of times before. The Hellcat pilot seemed to recognize his predicament. Rather than continuing the turn, where the Zero would simply cut tighter and tighter circles until settling onto his tail, the American rolled his aircraft level and pushed his throttle forward. Nakamura watched with satisfaction as the Grumman accelerated away in a shallow dive. Running, he thought. They always run when they realize they cannot turn with us. He followed, confident that his pursuit would end as it always did, with the American either shot down or forced into a turning fight where the Zero's agility would prove fatal. His airspeed continued to climb. 220 knots, 240, 260. The Zero's engine sang at high power. The sound transmitted through the airframe as a steady vibration. Nakamura had his target squarely in his sights, the distance between them holding steady at perhaps 300 yards. He prepared to fire again, waiting for the perfect moment when the American would be forced to turn, to maneuver, to give him the deflection shot he needed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But the American did not turn. The Hellcat simply continued accelerating in a straight line, its nose angled slightly downward, the powerful Pratt & Whitney engine pulling it faster and faster through the air. Nakamura frowned. His airspeed was now 280 knots, faster than he typically flew in combat. The Zero was built for agility, not speed, and he could feel the airframe beginning to protest. The control stick, which had been light and responsive moments ago, was growing heavier in his hands. He pushed harder on the stick to follow the American's shallow dive and noticed with alarm that the aircraft's response was sluggish. The ailerons, those large control surfaces that gave the Zero its magnificent rolling performance at low speeds, were beginning to stiffen. At 200 knots, they had been perfect. At 280 knots, they felt like they were moving through molasses. The American was pulling away. Not dramatically, not with the sudden burst of speed that might indicate superior power, but steadily, inexorably, the Grumman was opening the distance. 300 yards became 350, then 400. Nakamura checked his instruments. His airspeed now read 295 knots, nearly the maximum velocity his Zero could achieve in level flight. His engine was running at full power, the cylinders hammering at their limits, fuel consumption racing toward the danger zone. And still the Hellcat accelerated. The American pilot had pushed his aircraft to 300 knots, perhaps more, a speed that should have been impossible to sustain. Yet there it was, growing smaller in Nakamura's windscreen with each passing second. He tried to follow, tried to coax more speed from his Zero. But the aircraft had reached its limit. Worse, at these velocities, it had become nearly uncontrollable. Nakamura attempted to adjust his aim, to bring his gun sight to bear on the fleeing American. He pulled on the stick to climb slightly, hoping to gain a better angle. The Zero barely responded. The elevators, like the ailerons, had become almost immovable. It felt as though invisible hands were holding the control surfaces in place, fighting against his every input. The sensation was terrifying, alien, completely unlike anything he had experienced. In his many combat missions, he tried to roll, thinking perhaps he could dive more steeply and use gravity to help close the distance. The aileron controls refused to budge. At 300 knots, the Zero's large control surfaces, which provided such exquisite maneuverability at lower speeds, had become deadweight. The aerodynamic forces pressing against them were simply too great for any pilot to overcome. Nakamura strained against the stick with both hands, his muscles trembling with effort, but achieved only the smallest, most grudging movement. The American was now 500 yards away, then 600. In less than a minute, he had gone from being hunted to being completely safe, not through superior flying skill or tactical brilliance, but through simple, brutal speed. Nakamura eased back on his throttle, allowing his airspeed to drop below 280 knots. As the velocity decreased, he felt the controls gradually lighten, becoming responsive once more. But the Hellcat was gone. A diminishing speck on the horizon, headed back toward whichever carrier had launched it. For the first time in his combat career, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura felt a cold twist of doubt in his stomach. He had not been outmaneuvered, he had not been ambushed, he had held every advantage, altitude, position, and surprise. Yet the American had simply accelerated away, as though his Zero did not exist, as though the legendary fighter that had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years was nothing more than an obsolete relic. He turned back toward Rabaul, his mind churning with implications. If the Americans had built a fighter that could simply refuse combat by outrunning the Zero, if they had discovered a way to negate the Japanese advantage in maneuverability, then everything had changed. The rules of aerial warfare, written in the first 2 years of the Pacific conflict with Japanese blood and American tears, were being rewritten. What Nakamura could not have known, flying back to base, with his fuel gauges reading dangerously low, was that he had just witnessed the exploitation of a fundamental design flaw. His Zero, for all its grace and agility, had been optimized for a specific type of combat, the close-in, low-speed turning fight where Japanese pilots could leverage their training and their aircraft's incredible maneuverability. But the Americans had studied captured Zeros, had tested them, had analyzed every aspect of their performance, and had discovered something the Japanese designers already knew, but had accepted as an inevitable trade-off. At speeds above 200 knots, approximately 230 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons became progressively heavier. At 240 knots, approximately 276 miles per hour, rolling the aircraft required enormous physical effort. At 280 knots, roughly 322 miles per hour, the ailerons were almost immovable. And at 300 knots, about 345 miles per hour, the Zero was effectively uncontrollable in any axis except straight and level flight. This was not an accident of design. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's brilliant creator, had made conscious decisions to achieve the aircraft's extraordinary range and maneuverability. To save weight, the Zero used large, manually operated control surfaces without hydraulic assistance. To maximize agility at the low speeds typical of dogfighting, these surfaces were sized to be highly effective at 150 to 200 knots, but aerodynamic force increases with the square of velocity. What worked perfectly at low speed became a catastrophic weakness at high speed. The Grumman Hellcat, by contrast, had been designed from the beginning with high-speed combat in mind. American engineers, studying reports from the early Pacific battles and examining captured Zero fighters, including the famous Akutan Zero, recovered nearly intact in Alaska, had built an aircraft specifically to counter the Japanese advantages. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, weighing over 9,000 pounds, fully loaded, compared to the Zero's 5,500 pounds. It was powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney RU-2800 double wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower compared to the Zero's 940 horsepower Sakai engine. This combination of weight and power meant the Hellcat could reach a maximum speed of 380 miles per hour, fully 50 miles per hour faster than the Zero. More importantly, the Hellcat maintained excellent control authority at these high speeds. Its smaller control surfaces were sized appropriately for its weight and speed range, and while it could not match the Zero's turning performance at low speeds, it retained full controllability throughout its entire flight envelope. American pilots had been trained to exploit this disparity. They were instructed never to engage in turning fights with Zeros, where the Japanese advantage would prove fatal. Instead, they were taught to use their superior speed and dive performance. When attacked, a Hellcat pilot would accelerate away, using his more powerful engine to reach speeds where the Zero simply could not follow. If pursued, he would extend the distance until safe, then reverse and attack from an advantageous position. If outnumbered, he would dive away, confident that no Zero could match his terminal velocity. This tactical revolution, speed and energy management, rather than turning and burning, represented a fundamental shift in American fighter doctrine. It had been pioneered by pilots like John Thatch, who developed the famous Thatch-Weave defensive formation, and by men like Edward O'Hare, who recognized that American aircraft needed to fight differently to survive. But the tactics were only effective because the Hellcat provided the performance to execute them. Lieutenant Nakamura's experience that October morning was being replicated across the Pacific theater. Japanese pilots who had spent 2 years as the undisputed masters of aerial combat were encountering a new reality. The Hellcats appeared in August 1943, first with fighting Squadron 9 aboard the USS Essex, and immediately demonstrated their superiority. In their first major action at Marcus Island on August the 31st, Hellcats shot down 7 Japanese aircraft without loss. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 saw Hellcats achieve a kill ratio of 13-1 against Japanese defenders. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, an engagement that would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Hellcats would destroy over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The Zero's reign had ended, not because it was a bad aircraft, but because the Americans had built something specifically designed to defeat it. For the individual pilots like Nakamura, this transformation was both mysterious and terrifying. They understood that the new American fighters were faster, but the implications went deeper than simple velocity. The tactical flexibility that speed provided meant that Hellcat pilots could choose when and where to fight. They could engage if they had an advantage and disengage if they did not. They controlled the tempo of combat in a way the Japanese could not counter. Japanese engineers attempted to respond. The Zero received improvements throughout the war, including strengthened wings that raised the dive speed limit from 250 knots to 460 miles per hour in the A6M5 model introduced in 1944. But these modifications came too late and did too little. The fundamental design compromises that made the Zero light and maneuverable also made it vulnerable to the American tactical approach. Adding armor and self-sealing fuel tanks increased weight and reduced performance. Attempting to increase engine power required a complete redesign that the Japanese aviation industry, starved for resources and under constant bombing, could not accomplish in time. Back at Rabaul, Lieutenant Nakamura filed his combat report with growing frustration. He described the encounter exactly as it had happened. The Hellcats' ability to accelerate beyond his pursuit capability, the Zero's loss of control authority at high speed, the complete inability to force combat. His squadron commander listened with a grave expression that suggested this was not the first such report he had received. Other pilots gathered around, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and recognition. Disbelief because the Zero had been invincible for so long that its weaknesses seemed impossible. Recognition because many of them had experienced similar encounters, though few had been willing to articulate what it meant. The American advantage was not individual pilot skill, which Japanese pilots still believed they possessed in abundance, but systematic engineering superiority backed by tactical doctrine that exploited it. One of the older pilots, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and the invasion of the Philippines, spoke quietly. He had flown Zeros since 1941, had racked up over 40 victories, and had survived when so many of his comrades had not. He described how the early battles had been won through surprise and superior tactics, how the Zero's range had allowed them to appear where the enemy least expected, how their training and experience had overcome numerical disadvantages. But all of those advantages, he said, were being systematically eroded. The surprise was gone. The Americans knew the Zero's capabilities intimately. The tactical advantages had been countered by new American formations and fighting techniques. The training advantage was disappearing as experienced Japanese pilots died and were replaced by hastily trained youngsters who had logged bare minimums of flight time. And now, with the Hellcat and other advanced American fighters like the Chancefort Corsair entering service in large numbers, even the Zero's technical superiority in its designed mission profile was becoming irrelevant. The conversation turned to the broader strategic situation, though the pilots were careful to express their concerns in ways that did not imply criticism of the high command. Japan's industrial capacity was strained beyond its limits. American bombing raids were disrupting production of everything from aircraft to fuel to ammunition. The pilot training pipeline, which, before the war, had been the finest in the world, producing aviators with over 700 hours of flight time, was now graduating pilots with less than 100 hours. Meanwhile, American production was accelerating, with new carriers, new aircraft, and new pilots arriving in the Pacific in overwhelming numbers. Lieutenant Nakamura lay in his bunk that night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The mathematics of attrition warfare were inescapable. Japan had begun the war with approximately 3,000 combat-ready aircraft and perhaps 2,000 fully trained pilots. In the intervening 2 years, they had lost thousands of both, faster than they could be replaced. The Americans, by contrast, had entered the war with fewer frontline aircraft but with industrial capacity to produce tens of thousands per year. By 1943, American aircraft production exceeded Japanese production by a factor of 5 to 1. In some categories, like carrier-based fighters, the disparity was even greater. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation alone was producing Hellcats at a rate of 1 aircraft every hour around the clock by mid-1943. The entire production run would eventually total over 12,000 aircraft. Japanese production of all Zero variants throughout the entire war would total just over 10,000. When considered alongside the pilot training rates, the fuel availability, and the sheer geographical expanse of the Pacific that Japanese forces needed to defend, the situation appeared hopeless to anyone willing to examine it honestly. But honesty was dangerous in the imperial Japanese military culture of 1943. Officers who suggested that the war might be unwinnable were accused of defeatism. Pilots who reported American technical superiority too forcefully were accused of cowardice. The official narrative insisted that Japanese spirit, fighting determination, and loyalty to the emperor would overcome any material disadvantage. This cultural framework made it nearly impossible to have the kinds of frank tactical and strategic discussions that might have led to effective countermeasures. Nakamura understood these realities with increasing clarity. His encounter with the Hellcat had been a revelation, not just of American technical capability, but of a broader strategic problem. The United States was not simply producing more aircraft, they were producing better aircraft, designed specifically to counter Japanese strengths and exploit Japanese weaknesses. They were training pilots in effective tactics and giving them the equipment to execute those tactics successfully. And they were doing all of this while simultaneously fighting a war in Europe against Germany, demonstrating an industrial and organizational capacity that Japan could not hope to match. The next morning brought new missions. Nakamura and his squadron were tasked with intercepting an American bombing raid on the Japanese base at Rabaul. Intelligence reported 12 dive bombers, escorted by fighters, likely Hellcats. The Japanese pilots manned their Zeros with grim determination, knowing they were flying aircraft that could no longer compete on equal terms, but having no alternative. The interception occurred at 14,000 feet, with the Japanese fighters diving from altitude onto the American formation. The Hellcats immediately turned into the attack, and what followed was a brutal demonstration of the tactical shift Nakamura had witnessed the previous day. The American fighters did not attempt to turn with the Zeros. Instead, they used high-speed slashing attacks, diving through the Japanese formation, firing, and then extending away at speeds the Zeros could not match. When Japanese pilots gave chase, the Hellcats simply accelerated beyond pursuit range. When the Japanese tried to maintain position near the bombers, the Hellcats would reverse an attack from different angles, forcing the Zeros to turn and burn fuel defending while never allowing the kind of sustained dogfight where Japanese maneuverability would matter. It was a systematic dismantling of Japanese aerial tactics, executed with machine-like precision. Nakamura managed to damage one Hellcat during the engagement, his cannon rounds striking the American fighter's wing root. But the Grumman absorbed the hits, trailing smoke as it dove away at high speed, easily outdistancing his pursuit. The bombers completed their mission, dropping their ordnance on the airfield and destroying 3 parked aircraft. Of the 12 Zeros that had intercepted the raid, 2 failed to return. Both had been shot down by Hellcats in high-speed diving attacks, their pilots never having a chance to employ their aircraft's superior turning ability. The kill ratio spoke volumes. The Americans lost no aircraft. The Japanese lost 2 fighters, plus 3 more destroyed on the ground. This was not the glorious air combat of 1941 and early 1942, where skilled Zero pilots had achieved incredible victory tallies against inferior opposition. This was industrial warfare, where one side had better tools and knew how to use them. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated with numbing consistency. American raids struck Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Hellcats provided escort and flew combat air patrols over the advancing American forces. Japanese pilots flew sortie after sortie, achieving occasional victories, but suffering steady attrition that could not be sustained. The mathematics were inexorable. For every Hellcat shot down, the Americans could produce 5 more. For every American pilot killed, 3 more graduated from training. But for every Zero lost, Japanese industry struggled to replace it. For every Japanese pilot killed, the experience level of the surviving force decreased. Lieutenant Nakamura's personal experience illustrated this broader trend. He continued to fly combat missions through late 1943 and into 1944. His victory count rose slowly, reaching 42 by March 1944. But the nature of those victories had changed. In the early war years, he had shot down enemy aircraft in dogfights where his skill and his Zero's maneuverability gave him clear advantages. Now, most of his kills came from ambush attacks on damaged bombers or from catching inexperienced American pilots who made tactical errors. Whenever he engaged a competent Hellcat pilot who understood high-speed tactics, the result was the same. The American would refuse turning combat, would use superior speed to maintain or extend distance, and would only engage when he held positional advantage. Nakamura could not force these pilots to fight on his terms. The American control of tactical tempo meant they decided when combat occurred and when it did not. By June 1944, Nakamura had been transferred from Rabaul to a base in the Philippines, where Japanese forces were preparing for what they knew would be a decisive battle. American forces were advancing across the Central Pacific in a campaign of carrier raids and amphibious assaults that bypassed heavily defended Japanese positions, leaving them isolated and strategically irrelevant. The Philippines represented a last chance to achieve a significant victory, to blunt the American advance, and perhaps force a negotiated settlement rather than total defeat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began on June 19th, 1944. It would become the largest carrier battle in history and would demonstrate with absolute finality the extent of American aerial superiority. Japanese naval aviation committed virtually its entire remaining strength, launching wave after wave of aircraft against the American carrier task force. The Americans, with 15 carriers and nearly 900 aircraft, were ready. Nakamura flew in the second attack wave, part of a formation of over 100 aircraft that departed Guam at midday. The strike force included dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and 50 Zero fighters providing escort. As they approached the American fleet, still 60 miles distant, the radar operators aboard the American carriers detected their approach and vectored Hellcats to intercept positions. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Hellcats came in waves, diving from altitude in coordinated attacks that broke up the Japanese formations before they could reach the American ships. Nakamura found himself in a swirling melee, where everywhere he looked, aircraft were burning, falling, exploding. He shot down one Hellcat that made the mistake of trying to turn with him at low altitude, but moments later, another American fighter riddled his Zero with machine gun fire. His instrument panel shattered, oil pressure dropped, one of his cannons was jammed, and still the Hellcats came, seemingly endless in number, attacking with coordinated precision that spoke of excellent training and complete confidence in their aircraft. Nakamura managed to escape the immediate combat area by diving to wave-top height and running at full throttle toward Guam. His engine was hemorrhaging oil, running rough and threatening to seize at any moment, but the Hellcats did not pursue individual cripples. They remained focused on destroying the main attack force. He coaxed his damaged Zero back to Guam, landing with minimal fuel and a dying engine. As other survivors straggled back over the next hour, the scope of the disaster became clear. Of the 100-plus aircraft in his attack wave, fewer than 40 returned. Similar losses had been suffered by the other Japanese strike forces launched that day. American combat air patrols and shipboard anti-aircraft fire had created a killing zone that Japanese aircraft could not penetrate. The final tally for the Battle of the Philippine Sea showed Japanese losses of approximately 375 aircraft and 3 carriers sunk. American losses were fewer than 30 aircraft, most of which ditched in the ocean when they ran out of fuel during long-range strikes, with their pilots successfully rescued. The kill ratio of more than 12 to 1 represented not just tactical superiority, but fundamental dominance across every aspect of aerial warfare. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Nakamura survived the Philippine Sea battle, but his Zero did not. The aircraft was so badly damaged that it was salvaged for parts rather than repaired. He was assigned a new Zero, one of the latest A6M5 models with strengthened wings and slightly improved high-speed handling, but the improvements were marginal. The A6M5 could dive faster than earlier models without structural failure, but it still could not match the Hellcat's speed, and its controls still became dangerously heavy above 300 knots. The months following the Philippine Sea marked the final collapse of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. The catastrophic aircraft losses could not be replaced quickly enough. More critically, the pilot losses represented an irrecoverable hemorrhage of experience and skill. The Japanese training system, which had produced superbly skilled aviators before the war, had been gutted by the need to push pilots to frontline units with minimal preparation. New pilots arrived with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, sometimes as few as 60 hours, compared to the pre-war standard of 700 hours. These inadequately trained pilots stood no chance against veteran American aviators flying superior aircraft. The kill ratios became even more lopsided. By late 1944, American fighter pilots were achieving victories at rates of 20 or 30 to 1 in some engagements. The Japanese High Command, recognizing that conventional tactics could not overcome this disparity, began implementing desperate measures. The most infamous of these was the kamikaze program, where pilots would deliberately crash their aircraft into American ships. This tactic, born of desperation and the Japanese cultural willingness to embrace death for the emperor, represented an admission that Japanese pilots could no longer compete in conventional aerial combat. If they could not shoot down American aircraft, they would become guided missiles themselves, sacrificing their lives to achieve what their guns and bombs could not. Nakamura was offered the opportunity to volunteer for kamikaze duty in October 1944. He declined, not from cowardice, but from a conviction that his skills could be better employed in conventional combat, training younger pilots and passing on what he had learned. His superiors accepted this decision without comment, though the social pressure to volunteer was intense. Many of his contemporaries, fellow veterans of the early war years, chose the kamikaze path. Some believed it was the most honorable option. Others saw it as the only way to make a meaningful contribution given the hopeless tactical situation. The war continued into 1945, though by then the outcome was no longer in doubt. American forces invaded the Philippines, then Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, each battle bringing them closer to the Japanese home islands. Nakamura flew defensive missions over the Philippines, engaging American fighters and bombers in increasingly desperate circumstances. His victory count reached 47, but each victory felt hollow, a minor tactical success in the context of overwhelming strategic defeat. The technical evolution of American aircraft continued throughout this period. The Hellcat itself received improvements, including the F6F model with a more powerful engine and better ordnance carrying capability. But more ominously for Japanese defenders, new aircraft types were entering service. The Vought F4U Corsair, which had initially been relegated to land-based operations due to carrier landing difficulties, had been refined and was proving even more capable than the Hellcat in many respects. The Corsair could exceed 400 miles per hour and could outclimb and outdive virtually any Japanese fighter. American bomber technology was advancing as well. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a strategic bomber with pressurized cabin and remote-controlled gun turrets, could fly at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to reach them. Even when Zeros managed to intercept B-29s, their relatively light armament and poor high-altitude performance made them ineffective. The same speed limitations that prevented Zeros from catching Hellcats made it almost impossible to execute effective attacks on the fast-flying American bombers. By March 1945, Nakamura had been withdrawn from the Philippines to Japan itself, assigned to home defense duties. American carrier raids were striking targets throughout Japan with impunity. B-29s were conducting massive firebombing campaigns that were destroying Japanese cities. The strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where defeat was only a matter of time. Yet, the Japanese military leadership continued to insist on fighting to the last, preparing for a final decisive battle on the home islands that they believed would break American will to continue the war. Nakamura flew his last combat mission on August 13, 1945, 2 days before Japan's surrender. He intercepted a formation of American carrier aircraft striking targets near Tokyo. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. Hellcats dove on his formation, shooting down 3 Zeros before the Japanese pilots could react. Nakamura engaged one American fighter in a brief turning fight at low altitude, but the Hellcat pilot simply disengaged by accelerating away, exactly as Nakamura had witnessed nearly 2 years earlier over the Solomons. The pattern had never changed. The tactical advantage the Hellcat's high-speed capability provided was insurmountable, given the Zero's design limitations. Japanese pilots had adapted as best they could, developing tactics that emphasized ambush attacks and tried to force low-speed engagements where the Zero's advantages could be employed. But these adaptations were ultimately futile against an opponent who could simply refuse combat whenever the tactical situation was unfavorable. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, Lieutenant Nakamura was still alive, one of the small minority of pre-war naval aviators who had survived the entire conflict. His final victory tally stood at 47, a number that would have made him an ace many times over by any standard, but which felt meaningless in the context of Japan's total defeat. He had witnessed the complete evolution of the Pacific Air War, from the heady days of Japanese dominance in 1941 to the catastrophic collapse of 1944 and 45. The story of the Zero versus the Hellcat encompasses far more than simple performance specifications or tactical innovations. It represents a case study in how engineering decisions, industrial capacity, and tactical doctrine interact to determine military outcomes. The Zero was not a bad aircraft. In fact, for its intended mission profile, long-range fighter operations, with emphasis on maneuverability, it was brilliantly designed. Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi had created an aircraft that perfectly matched Japanese naval aviation doctrine of the late 1930s. But that doctrine, and the aircraft designed to execute it, proved inadequate against an opponent who studied Japanese strengths, identified Japanese weaknesses, and systematically developed counters. The Americans built the Hellcat specifically to defeat the Zero. They accepted that they could not match Japanese maneuverability, so they didn't try. Instead, they built an aircraft that was faster, more durable, and could outclimb the Zero at high altitudes. They trained their pilots to exploit these advantages through tactics that emphasized speed and energy management rather than turning performance. The high-speed escape capability that Nakamura first witnessed in October 1943 became the defining characteristic of American fighter tactics in the Pacific. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't fit the romantic image of knights of the air engaged in duels of skill and courage. But it worked. Hellcat pilots could engage when they held advantage and disengage when they did not. This flexibility, this control over the tactical tempo of combat proved decisive. The numbers tell the story. The F6F Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against all Japanese aircraft types during World War II. Individual Hellcat pilots became aces with remarkable speed. David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, scored all 34 of his victories in Hellcats. The aircraft was credited with destroying 5,600 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter type. Of the approximately 12,200 Hellcats produced during the war, fewer than 300 were lost in air-to-air combat. These statistics reflect not just the Hellcats' technical capabilities, but the systematic way American forces approached the problem of aerial warfare. They studied the enemy. They identified weaknesses. They built aircraft and developed tactics specifically to exploit those weaknesses, and they trained pilots thoroughly in executing those tactics. The result was not close fights decided by individual skill, but systematic destruction of Japanese air power. The Zero's high-speed control limitations were well known to Japanese engineers. They understood that the aircraft's large, manually operated control surfaces would become heavy at high speeds. They knew the dive speed was limited, but these were considered acceptable trade-offs for the performance characteristics the Navy demanded. What they did not anticipate was an enemy who would make high-speed combat the centerpiece of their tactical doctrine, who would build aircraft specifically to fight in the speed regime where the Zero was most vulnerable. This failure of imagination, this inability to anticipate how an opponent might approach the problem of aerial combat, was not unique to Japanese aviation. Throughout military history, armed forces have optimized for the last war rather than the next war. The French Army in 1940 built the Maginot Line based on their experience in World War I, only to be defeated by German armor that simply went around it. The British Navy in the early 20th century built massive battleships, only to find that aircraft carriers and submarines had made them obsolete. The Zero story fits this pattern. It was designed for the kind of war Japanese planners expected, a conflict where range, maneuverability, and surprise would allow a smaller, more skilled force to achieve victory over numerically superior opponents. For the first year of the Pacific War, this doctrine appeared vindicated. But when the Americans absorbed the initial losses, studied the problem, and responded with aircraft and tactics specifically designed to counter Japanese advantages, the Zero's fundamental design limitations became fatal weaknesses. The human cost of this technical mismatch was staggering. Japanese naval aviation began the war with approximately 3,500 trained pilots. By the war's end, an estimated 16,000 Japanese naval aviators had been killed. Many of these men died flying Zeros against Hellcats in engagements where they never had a realistic chance of victory. They were brave, they were skilled, but they were flying aircraft that could not compete against the American technological and tactical response. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura survived the war, but his story was not typical. Most Zero pilots who flew throughout the conflict did not live to see its end. Of the pre-war trained aviators who fought in the opening campaigns, fewer than 10% survived to August 1945. The attrition rate among later generations of pilots was even worse. Many new pilots died in their first combat mission, shot down by veteran American aviators who recognized inexperienced opponents and exploited their mistakes ruthlessly. In the post-war years, Nakamura worked in commercial aviation, helping to rebuild Japan's devastated civil air transport system. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, a reticence common among Japanese veterans. But in the 1970s, as historical interest in the Pacific War increased, he granted a series of interviews to aviation historians. His accounts provided valuable insights into the Japanese perspective on the technical and tactical evolution of the war. When asked about the Hellcat and its impact on the air war, Nakamura was remarkably candid. He acknowledged that American aircraft were superior in most respects by 1943. He described the frustration of flying an aircraft that could not engage the enemy on equal terms, that could not force combat when the opponent chose to disengage. He spoke of the psychological impact of watching victory slip away, not through any failure of courage or skill, but through simple technological inferiority. Most poignantly, he described his memory of that October morning in 1943 when he first witnessed a Hellcat accelerate beyond his Zero's pursuit capability. In that moment, he said, he understood that the war was lost, not immediately, not without further sacrifice and struggle, but inevitably. When your aircraft cannot even catch the enemy, when they can choose to fight or not fight at their discretion, the outcome is predetermined. All that remains is the time it takes for the reality to become apparent to everyone. The technical specifications that determined this outcome were straightforward. The Zero's maximum speed of approximately 330 miles per hour compared to the Hellcat's 380 miles per hour. The Zero's control stiffening above 200 knots compared to the Hellcat's excellent control authority throughout its speed range. The Zero's light construction and lack of armor compared to the Hellcat's rugged durability. These differences, seemingly modest when listed as numbers, translated into overwhelming tactical advantage in actual combat. Modern analysis of World War II air combat has confirmed what pilots like Nakamura experienced firsthand. Speed and energy management proved more important than maneuverability in determining air combat outcomes. Aircraft that could dictate the terms of engagement achieved better results than aircraft with superior turning performance. The lessons learned in the Pacific influenced post-war fighter design worldwide, with every major air force emphasizing speed, climb rate, and energy retention over low-speed turning ability. The Zero itself continued to serve in diminishing numbers through the war's end, but its effectiveness declined steadily as American aircraft technology advanced and Japanese pilot quality deteriorated. By 1945, Zeros were being used primarily for kamikaze attacks, a role for which their low-speed handling and long range remained useful, but which represented the abandonment of conventional fighter operations. The aircraft that had once been the terror of Pacific skies had become little more than manned cruise missiles. The broader strategic implications of American aerial superiority extended far beyond air-to-air combat. With control of the skies, American forces could conduct amphibious operations with minimal interference from Japanese aircraft. They could bomb Japanese positions and supply lines with relative impunity. They could provide close air support to ground forces, giving American troops a decisive advantage in any engagement. The collapse of Japanese air power made every subsequent American victory easier and less costly. This strategic dominance was built on the foundation of tactical advantages like the Hellcats' high-speed capability. The ability to engage or disengage at will meant American pilots could conserve their forces, could choose battles they would win, could avoid engagements where casualties would be high. Japanese pilots, flying aircraft that could not impose their will on opponents, had no such luxury. They took every fight, won or lost, because they could not refuse combat when the Americans chose to engage. The industrial dimension of this disparity cannot be overstated, even if the Zero had been technically equal to the Hellcat, which it was not by 1943. Japan simply could not produce aircraft in sufficient numbers to compete. American shipyards were launching escort carriers at a rate of one per week by mid-1944. Aircraft factories were producing thousands of fighters, bombers, and other aircraft types every month. The scale of American industrial mobilization dwarfed anything Japan could achieve, even under optimal circumstances. This industrial superiority manifested in countless ways beyond simple numbers. American maintenance and logistics systems ensured that aircraft remained operational at high rates. Spare parts were readily available. Damaged aircraft could be repaired quickly. Pilots who survived being shot down over water could usually be rescued by well-organized search and rescue operations. Japanese forces had none of these advantages. Their logistics systems were strained beyond capacity. Spare parts were scarce. Maintenance quality declined as experienced ground crews were killed or reassigned. Pilots shot down over water usually drowned, taking their experience and training with them. The story of Lieutenant Nakamura and the Hellcats' high-speed advantage encapsulates all of these broader themes. It shows how technical specifications translated into tactical advantages. It demonstrates how tactical advantages aggregated into strategic dominance. It illustrates the human cost of technological inferiority and the psychological impact of fighting a battle you cannot win. And it highlights the importance of institutional adaptation, the ability to study an opponent, identify their strengths and weaknesses, and systematically develop counters. For the young officers studying this history today, whether at naval academies, Air Force schools, or in civilian aviation programs, the lessons remain relevant. Aircraft design involves trade-offs. Optimizing for one characteristic means accepting compromises in others. The key is ensuring that your optimization matches the actual combat environment you will face, not the environment you hope to face or imagine facing. The Japanese optimized the Zero for the kind of air combat they expected, and found themselves unprepared when the Americans imposed a different style of warfare. Similarly, tactical doctrine must be flexible enough to adapt to technological change and enemy innovation. The Japanese had developed excellent tactics for the Zero's capabilities, but these tactics assumed the enemy would fight on Japanese terms. When the Americans refused to do so, Japanese doctrine had no effective response. American doctrine, by contrast, evolved continuously throughout the war, incorporating lessons learned, adapting to new aircraft capabilities, and developing new approaches to emerging challenges. The human stories behind the technical and tactical analysis deserve remembrance as well. Men like Lieutenant Nakamura were not villains. They were skilled professionals fighting for their country. Under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, they executed their missions with courage and determination, achieving what victories they could, despite facing overwhelming odds. The fact that they ultimately lost does not diminish their individual accomplishments or their personal sacrifices. Similarly, the American pilots who flew Hellcats were not superhuman. They were ordinary men who happened to have better tools and better training. Their victory was a collective achievement, built on the work of engineers who designed superior aircraft, factories that produced them in vast numbers, logistics personnel who kept them operational, and commanders who developed effective tactics. Individual heroism mattered, but it was heroism enabled and multiplied by systematic advantages across every aspect of air warfare. The technological race between the Zero and the Hellcat was ultimately won before either aircraft ever engaged in combat. It was won in the design offices where American engineers studied captured Japanese fighters and built counters. It was won in the factories where American industrial capacity produced overwhelming numbers of aircraft. It was won in the training schools where American pilots learned tactics specifically developed to exploit their aircraft's advantages, and it was won in the broader strategic context where American resources, both human and material, simply dwarfed what Japan could muster. That October morning in 1943, when Lieutenant Nakamura first watched a Hellcat accelerate beyond his Zero's capability to pursue, was not the beginning of Japanese defeat. That had been determined by decisions made years earlier, by strategic choices about industrial capacity and military doctrine, by engineering compromises and tactical assumptions. But it was the moment when the reality of that defeat became viscerally, undeniably clear to one skilled pilot who suddenly understood that his aircraft, his tactics, and ultimately his entire service's approach to aerial warfare had been systematically countered. The Zero remained a capable aircraft within its design limitations. Against slower opponents, or in the hands of exceptionally skilled pilots who could force low-speed combat, it could still be deadly. But against the Hellcat, flown by competent pilots who understood high-speed tactics, it was simply outmatched. The Japanese had built a knife for a knife fight. The Americans had built a rifle and learned to shoot from a distance the knife could not reach. The outcome, once both weapons were deployed, was never in doubt. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.